this is a little bit bleak to begin with. I promise it will get better, hopefully in reality, not just in this talk. So first of all, I just want to say that we systematically underestimated climate change. Okay, so this is a figure that I put together with colleagues. And what we did here is we looked at the different IPCC reports for climate impacts over time. So we went from 2001 up to 2022, those different reports. And then we looked at the impacts in different areas, for example, tipping points. And this is the picture for tipping points. So what we thought would happen at 5 degrees in 2001, we're now in the danger zone today. That's how serious things have got. We've underestimated how fast climate change could impact our systems. On the whole, we've been pretty good with estimating the temperatures, but those impacts on agriculture, those impacts on water systems, on built systems, those have been underestimated. Okay? And if you look across all the different impacts, we've seen this big underestimation. We don't have as much time as we thought we would. Now, this is true for the UK as well. I mean, all of us are in the UK right now, and this is quite an astonishing figure that I put together for a report on cost of living. And what this shows is the climate change risk assessment in 2012, and the second one in 2021. And what you can see here is the change in the risk level between 2012 and 2021. And you can see how in both of those risk levels have risen incredibly. Now, they're the same risk level, so but very high. That's £1 billion of damage every year. And so that's the same scale on each one there, okay? And our biggest impact is floods. And floods are already sort of about 800 million a year, moving towards over 1 billion as we move into the future, okay? And so this is why this is so important for the drinks industry as well, is that flooding is going to be very important to address. I'm sorry for these really small slides, by the way. I hope you can see them okay. And if not, we can also talk about it afterwards. I can send you the presentations. But in the latest UK climate change risk assessment, I think this is quite an astonishing statement. Better representation of the landscape have highlighted that there's a very small chance, less than 0.02%, of exceeding 40 degrees by 2040. Now, in science terms, better representation of the landscape, we're really proud of this. And of course, a year later, we breached 40 degrees. So that's how fast things are moving. Now, I'm not casting shade on the scientists here. The science is really, really difficult because we're parameterizing a lot of these models in historical data, and we're moving into complete unknown, well, large unknown here. And if we look at these climate changes on agriculture, I alluded to this earlier. This is where I think a lot of the sort of concern I have right now, especially in food price inflation and what that can do to societies. If we have a look at what's called multi-breadbasket failures, so there's these big reductions in yields across multiple bread baskets all within the same year due to extreme weather events. Now, we've always had these impacts. So for corn, for example, we used to have these multi-breadbasket failures once every 16 years. Okay, so things go up and down, we have storage, we make our way through it. At 1.5 degrees, once every 3 years, and at 2 degrees, once every 2 years. And so you can see these compounding impacts as we move into the future. Now, that is the most sensitive crops, but we do see similar changes in soy and in the other crops as well. We see this big jump to 1.5. So it's my contention that as we move through this next decade, that's when this big jump is going to hit us. And note, in Europe, about 60% of crops, like barley, are used to feed animals. We have some brewers here. About 60-odd% of barley in this country is used to feed animals. Okay, so maybe there's a question about where this barley and where this food could be going. Okay, just some details about climate change and drinks. Around 90% of traditional wine regions could be impossible to grow wine in this century. In coffee, some species of coffee could be unfeasible in 35 to 75% of current regions. In beer, 4 to 18% declines in hops by 2050. Beer prices could double in some countries. In dairy, about 10% of milk productivity declines, even with adaptation due to climate change. Because remember, it's not just us that suffer in the heat, it's the animals too. In juice, we've got very erratic orange juice. I mean, many of you probably followed this massive declines in Brazil last year, a bounce back this year, but a lot more volatility in the system. And in tea, extreme weather events can reduce yields 11 to 44%. This is just a range of different scientific studies, just taking these percentages out. Now, so that's sort of the where we're heading. But I do want to make a really important point, and that is that we do have agency, and we can change the way the future looks. And this is work that we did some years ago now. And what we did was we looked at what the emissions and what the temperature would be with current efforts. Okay? So just looking at how much effort we're currently putting in, and what's the change in that effort every year, and what does that look like if we persist that over the future. And so we can see the historic emissions here in white, and we can see the different emission trajectories for the IPCC there. And what we can see in the red line is our prediction, and we're pretty much on that at the moment. We might see changes in the future, but you can see that we're under the highest predictions of the IPCC. That is, we've avoided some of the worst case scenarios. But of course, from what I'm describing here, is the middle of the road scenarios are a disaster. So we've avoided these high impact scenarios, and if we hadn't have underestimated the impacts of climate change, maybe that would have been okay. But unfortunately we have, and we need to be much, much faster in our reductions. Now, if you look into the agricultural system alone is enough to push us beyond 1.5. I mean, we're basically above 1.5 degrees at this point, but even beyond 2 degrees of warming. And it's not just climate change, it's of course all these other environmental damages. Now we have this framework called the planetary boundaries, which are all these different areas of environmental damage beyond which we go. If we exceed, we can actually cause irreversible harm. And if we look at agricultural damage, it's the second largest driver of climate change, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, the biggest driver of land system change, of freshwater change, of nitrogen and phosphorus, the second biggest driver of acidification, the second biggest driver of aerosol loading. The interesting thing about this, in the UK and Europe now, we've done such a good job in turning down the coal power stations and taking them offline, that actually agriculture now is becoming the largest driver of air pollutants, both in rural and in urban areas. So that's something to keep an eye on. And on top of that, we've also got zoonotic diseases and microbial resistance. So this great food and drink transformation that we need to actually address this problem comprises of 3 main things. It comprises of a shift in diets, reductions in waste, and improvements in production. But these, as I sort of hinted to earlier, are not created equal. These are the different interventions across the x-axis here, and these are the amounts of emissions that we would expect by the end of the century. So the bar on the left is where we go if we make no other changes. And as we go to the bars on the right, that's as we put more and more changes in. And you can see in the blue there, the plant-rich diets has the largest option compared to these other interventions. And it actually keeps us below that 1.5 degree limit. And in our work, if you take all the high-income countries and you shifted people to a plant-rich diet. Now, here's one messaging on communications, which is important. Plant-based doesn't really get you anywhere. Vegan doesn't get you anywhere. But plant-rich, that's what we need to be going for. Because rich, I mean, people want to be rich. It's a George Lakoff type idea of put in mind what you want to be. So plant-rich, which is good for us and good for the planet. And so when we model a diet, which is roughly a beef burger every 2 weeks or so it's not cutting out meat, and there's plenty of dairy still. There's plenty of cheese in there still. I say plenty. It's a bit of a cut, but it's not a massive cut. In high-income nations, we find that the emissions from the food systems drops 61%. Now, if we were able to use that land and free up that land, like in the UK under this diet, we'd save an area the size of Scotland. Now, I want you to sort of think about what that means in the drinks industry if you're in wine in the UK. Having so much nature, biodiversity, so much floodwater absorption, so much access to nature nearby the vineyards, which will probably be more of those in the future. These are huge, huge areas of land. And if you're able to rewild that land, you would double the benefits of the dietary change alone by drawing carbon down on that land, by the vegetation and the soil organic carbon. Something like this. So you can imagine what that means for floodwater resilience, for storm surge resilience. So what does this mean for drinks? Well, dairy is one of the worst producers, and many of you may already know that. I just put this together very quickly, and you can see the milks in the orange there. You can see beer and wine on the blue, and this is per litre. So, the unit's not particularly brilliant because, you don't want to drink a litre of wine in one go necessarily, but you can see the cow's milk being the worst there. Now, discretionary non-dairy drinks are around 5% of the total, so that's beer, coffee, tea. And so actually, even though each one of them on their own is quite small, they add up to quite a lot, and they're discretionary. They're not necessarily things that we have to drink. I just want to take a little detour into some work some colleagues did at the Hestia team, and this is looking at soil organic carbon in vineyards. And this is recent work that's just coming out soon. And what they did was they said, can we increase soil organic carbon in vineyards? They did a meta-analysis of soil organic carbon sampled from Spain, France, Italy, US, Australia, and South Africa. And they looked at conventional management compared to 5 alternative managements. I know there's a lot of wine people in the audience, so I think this will probably be really interesting for people. So if we look at organic amendments, biochar, pruning residues, no-till, and cover crops, you can see how those interventions all increase the soil organic carbon sequestration rate. And if you add them together, you typically get a little bump as well, so in combination. Keep an eye out for this work because it might be of real interest, and you can get in touch with Florian there, and I can share his email address later. One of the interesting things from this is that we can't make wine production carbon neutral with this alone. But what you can do is you can inset the emissions of that phase before the wine leaves the gate. So you can actually have about 30% of the total footprint sequestered onto the land. And on top of that, of course, increase soil quality, reduce erosion risks, increase resilience to climate change. But moving back to this land issue, because I think this land issue is really, really key. I mean, if you want to think about any of the things that we want to do with land, in terms of our biodiversity targets, our housing targets, any of these targets, we're going to need land, yeah? And if we have a look at this picture here, we can see the different consumption of different food types across the x-axis in different colors. And we've got the animal products in red, and we've got the plant products in green. And you can see that our current consumption is above the total UK agricultural land. And that's because we import a lot. So actually, right now, we're importing more than the total area of the UK. We're eating above the total area of the UK, and we're having to import from overseas. Now, I wanted to have a look at what this looked like under our diet So we've still got some meat left. We've still got dairy left. And this is the total agricultural land now. So this is a diet that would be much, much healthier for us. And you can see how we've just dropped the land use way down. Now, if I start putting in what we need from land, so this is our 30 by 30 biodiversity target. Wow, we've already done it, but just by saving that land. This is our 2050 biodiversity target. This is the land that we might need for carbon sequestration from the Climate Change Committee. So this is looking at growing forests and drawing that carbon down. So the only way that we get to do any of the things that we're talking about from the land that we have is with this dietary change. There are no other ways, I'm afraid. Now, I did also put another little section there because I know there's a lot of wine growers here, but you could even free up a little bit of a section even there for some more wine. So there are so many benefits to being plant-rich, and I think this is the important point that I want to sort of impress upon you today, that we all need to be pulling together on this. So we're talking about resilient regenerative agriculture, which may take up more land. You may have lower yields from that production, but if we have that land freed up, then we have that land available. That includes things like multi-cropping, crop diversity, perennials, smaller scale agriculture, even things like less but better meat with smaller systems and mixed systems with animals. And on the whole, as I say, with some of our, and we can talk about this a little bit later, we've done fair bit of research on this now, and on the whole, this means a smaller system, a more efficient system, but also more income for farmers. There is an interesting question here about bioplastics, because bioplastics is sort of touted as this big option that we have for actually greening the plastics industry, but this is also land. We also need land to grow the crops in order to produce the bioplastics. So I did a little calculation, and this is a little aside, but approximately 600,000 tons of plastic bottles are thrown out in this country each year. Now, if we wanted to make that with bioplastics, according to sort of just the middle-of-the-road calculations on this, we'd need an area the size of Greater London to do that. So where are we going to get this land from? If we want our packaging to become more environmentally friendly and go bioplastics, where is this land going to come from again? It's going to have to come from some of these shifts that I'm pointing out. If we're talking about timber buildings, if we're talking about meeting biodiversity targets, I've talked about some of these before, green space for mental health, then your answer is going to be plant-rich diets. And I think this is where the lobbying from the industry comes in, because this should be in your interests too. We need this future of much more biodiversity, of much more carbon resilience for your industry. And unfortunately, we're fighting an uphill battle against an industry that's very, very well motivated. So the same people who've worked with big tobacco, big oil and gas, the same people are now working with the meat industry. And in fact, there's various investigative reports that have looked at this. It's exactly the same PR companies. So Edelman that worked with tobacco back in the 70s are now working with big meat and dairy. And they're sponsoring the younger influencers because they know that's how you get people not to change. If you can embed people's diets early, it's very, very difficult for them to change. So they're targeting especially young men, between 18 and 26, and with just an onslaught of information and misinformation and disinformation. So, for example, the biggest YouTuber in the world took money from the meat industry to push chicken consumption. Okay, so I want to point out that this is your fight too. If you want to see this future where we do have more of this biodiversity, this is your fight also. And I think when we look at the public, because you might say, well, how much do people really want these changes? And actually, when you look across polling, we typically underestimate one another. Typically, the support for a policy is about double what you think it is. So be it on carbon taxes or renewable energy. It might surprise you to hear that about 4%, only 4% of the UK population are climate deniers. And in fact, people who are intending to vote reform, about 74% of people who are intending to vote reform either like or don't mind wind turbines. So this is a completely different picture to the one you might get from the news. Here is another poll. Here we've got frequent flyer levies, electric vehicles, increasing vegetarian and vegan options, higher taxes on red meat and dairy products. So what do you think the level of support would be for higher taxes on meat products? Anybody want to shout out? 3%. Yeah, I thought it'd be really, really low too. I thought it'd be miserably low. I was ready to be really, really depressed. The answer is 47% supported. So, we get surprised over and over again. We actually tend to underestimate our neighbours. And we saw this with the Climate Change Assembly. When people sat down from all across the country, about 108 people from all across the country, all sorts of backgrounds, and they were talked, they talked amongst themselves, they talked to experts. The results that they said, what do you want to do for climate change? And the results at the end were far beyond where the politicians were at. They were talking about banning SUVs. They were talking about frequent flyer levies. They were talking about reductions in meat. This is far beyond what any politician is talking about. So there's also this democratic issue here that actually the politicians are not listening or not hearing the polling and where people are at. So I just want to finish up the talk now, and hopefully we've got some time for questions. And I think just from my experience in communication so far, here's some sort of things that I've learned. The first thing is to be honest. We really need to know where we're going in order so that we can avoid those outcomes, and also that we can not be surprised when they happen. So at the moment, when we're talking to people, when we're talking about this inflation, there are studies that are suggesting 3% year-on-year inflation in food prices by 2035. And we're already seeing this inflation. We saw over 10% inflation in some of the crops that we mentioned earlier. So we know this is the way things are going to go. So what's our answer to that? Well, first of all, we need to take this in and we need to be emotionally engaging with it so that we think, well, what can we do about it? But we need to give those as solutions. Then we need to act. And it's only through the acting that you are given hope. So often I'm asked, are you optimistic or are you optimistic about the future? I say, I'm not really either. I'm not really pessimistic or optimistic. But what gives me hope is when I see things change when I see people putting themselves out there and being brave in the way that actually they could be brave if we all understood how much other people care. We're always held back in these situations, in these rooms, thinking, well, if I talk about meat taxes, nobody's going to support me on that in this room. Well, actually, they just might. So we need to keep that in mind all the time. And we have to repeat ourselves. And as the IPCC says, every action matters, every bit of warning matters, every year matters, and every choice really matters. And this is one of my favorite cartoons of all time, which is saying all the things that we could get from this transition: energy independence, rainforests, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, renewables, etc., etc. And somebody says, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Because I think we will, if we make it into this future in a sustainable way, look back and go, why on earth didn't we do that earlier? Okay, and I have written a popular science book that takes this perspective of pessimism and optimism, or at least hope, and looks at the trajectory that we're looking forward into the future and what we can do about it, all based in the science. And there's some copies at the back there if you want to have a copy. But I think we've hopefully got some time for questions, and thank you very much.
Has anyone got any questions? Yes, Judith.
Thank you. That was amazing and really, really clear, a call to action. And I've got lots of thoughts for us as a group and what we might do about it. But I wondered, it's linking back to our panel discussion and the comment about data. And I wondered if you could explain a bit more about Hestia, because it's one of the best kept secrets. And it's something there that's free, it's being supported, it's open access, there's a fantastic downloadable methodology. So
I think you did it really well. So it's fantastic. It's coming from Oxford. It's coming from colleagues of mine at the Oxford Martin School. And you can dive into all sorts of data. It's a data geek's delight. And it's still ongoing. It's trying to get more and more data, more and more different production types, more and more different types of foods, more and more different types of systems. Some of these systems are incredibly complicated, as I'm sure you all know. And so really delving down and then looking at sort of what management is happening on the farm, what that implies for the different footprints and the life cycle assessments that are coming out is really important. So do check out Hestia. It's open online. You can go in, you can download things to your heart's delight, and you can look at loads of different footprints.
Jane.
Great, thank you. Really, really interesting. I guess I've got two questions. One, this is all about farming and food, which is obviously got a big role to play. You don't touch upon distribution, how products get from A to B, transport systems. You don't touch on packaging. I mean, if we just did this, is that enough? Is that what you're saying? We don't have to worry about those other aspects?
Yeah.
and then the other question, well, maybe I'll...
Oh, no, okay. So energy transition is all in the book. So when you have a think about the transportation emissions, they're typically much lower, as I'm sure many people know in the room. They will be addressed through other sort of means in terms of or maybe not, if we saw last week with Trump and the International Maritime Organization, but they will hopefully be addressed. Now, some of those things are really easily addressed now. So the last mile type stuff, that's already being addressed. Even sort of the sort of medium distance trucks, probably going to get sort of batteries for that. The longer distance, like the shipping, is going to be tricky. And there may be interactions with the food system there if we start using ammonia as a fuel for ships. But, I see these as largely sort of they're largely outside the control of many food system operators. So yeah, I mean, and if you look at the emissions profile, about a third, 40% is happening on the farm, another third is from like deforestation. So it is a smaller percentage of the total.
Yeah, I guess my question comes back to the wine industry. So over 50% of wine that's made globally is transported and sold, exported around the world. We know that packaging and distribution account for over 50% of carbon footprint. So that's where that's coming from. It may be quite different to other food systems. The other question I was going to ask was about Judith's and the panel earlier talking about data. And the thing that strikes me about data is I completely get the data and how valuable it is. I do wonder about the capacity and the amount of energy used and to drive technology, to keep the data, to use it, to make it accessible, and all the huge data farms that we're talking about are required to do that, and how we make that sustainable.
Thanks so much. So okay, so two things. On the packaging, so there have been stuff done in the industry, of course, which is sort of larger palletization, but maybe we do also have to take the position that actually we just need to buy more locally in Europe, and we just don't get those longer distance transports anymore. Honestly, given the future that we face, that should be it, probably. But I mean, if we have a look at the data side of things, typically it hasn't been an issue up until AI. So we've really, when every generation of new data centers come out, they just lower the energy requirements so much, and they're electric. So electric is really easy to make renewable. It's brilliant. The problem is now we've got AI, and there's such a big demand for the energy system that you've got a lot of AI companies now putting gas-powered stations next to those their facilities. So on the data side of things, on Hestia and those sorts of things, I wouldn't even worry. I wouldn't even blink an eyelid. I wouldn't blink an eyelid about email or data or even internet searches. Where I start worrying is now how quickly AI is scaling, and what that means is it's outrunning the energy system transition. And then you're putting more gas in, and actually is more intensive. So if you want an answer on that, it's AI.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. Thought it was really, really interesting. Mainly on meat, could you give us some information on the fish industry and maybe the opportunity that the ocean might have for the planet?
Yeah, thanks very much. So, fish obviously is a really big sector as well, and also a big source of emissions, especially when you see sort of the open sea trawling. It's a very clear sort of example of what Daniel Pauly said. We are literally waging war against the ocean. And when you look at how much is being caught, it certainly looks like that. When I think about seafood in general, I think the shift really there has to be more and more towards sort of shellfish. And what we see from shellfish is they can actually be filter feeders as well, so they can actually clean up, and their environmental impacts are much, much lower than the other sources of fish. Of course, what I'm talking about when I talk about all of these dietary changes is high-income people. I am not talking about anybody who has protein deficiency who couldn't get it any other way. So just to make abundantly clear, and the same thing for fishing as well. Local fishing. I'm just not talking about that, but I'm talking about these really large fishing systems. So I think our focus really has to be much more on shellfish.
Thank you. Any other questions? In which case, it's just left for me to say thanks very much, Paul. I think it's a pretty sobering message, but hopefully not too sobering, because we have some lovely wines now to move on to from our partners. Obviously, the message that I'm going to take away from today and from Paul's session is the one of regenerative viticulture and the potential for soil organic carbon. Obviously, anyone that knows me will not be surprised by that. But if anyone wants to take any message away, let's go with regenerative viticulture. And also, let's thank Paul so much for that enlightening talk. I will make sure that we distribute some of that data and those slides to everybody in our next newsletter. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the evening.
Yeah.